So the Institute is a state-established school within a school at the University of Toledo. So we have a separate line of appropriations and also are an authority to offer courses, degree programs, public events. I would boil it down to responding to immediate needs in terms of civic education for students across the board, but also in providing a deeper education in constitutional studies in American government. So we'll have 2 minors in the fall, so a minor in constitutional studies, and then a minor in engineering leadership, which has some crossover. But so the engineers will learn how to speak and write in the rhetoric course. But they'll also have a certain element where they focus on thinking through the role of someone in applied science, but as a leader within a democratic republic. And then in 2 years from now, or next year in the fall 2026, we'll have our own major in constitutional studies. And so our goal is to become a kind of honors college in constitutional studies and government at the University of Toledo that has a depth of study for those who want to take our major and minor, but then breadth as far as we want to get as many students at UT through our American Constitutional Tradition course, or 2000 level course as possible. And then offer opportunities like colloquia, so evening conversations with 14 or 15 students who are selected, so they receive an invitation to come. We've had 2 on Frederick Douglass so far. A little bit by chance that we had 2 on Douglass. They won't all be on him, but a lot to discuss there. 1 on Douglass's thoughts about Abraham Lincoln, and the other on Douglass's position in the debate about whether the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. So he argued that it wasn't, and he argued against William Lloyd Garrison, who suggested, or did more than suggest, that it was. So we've had students in colloquia, in events, in dinners with speakers, now tonight with our fireside chat, which we hope to make a kind of running event.
So a lot of my work these days, and I have a number of hats that I put on, but is on falling trust in society and in institutions and rising political polarization. And one of the reasons I think it ultimately made sense for me to join the institution was that the centers across the state, where he's been so important as a leader, because there's 5 across the public universities in Ohio now, getting started through the 2023 law, is trying to create opportunities in Ohio public universities to study things that just aren't taught, but that probably ought to be, things that are genuinely enriching. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with our different courses. But one of the things that I've been doing is I was going to teach a sequence on American conservatism, American liberalism. And I'm teaching American conservatism now, teaching figures that I actually never had the chance to teach. We're building up and reading a lot of the more kind of theory of American conservatism, but working our way to Reagan. And one of the things I'm going to ask a little bit about tonight is how Reagan thought about conservatism as a thinker himself. And having the opportunity to get some of these ideas out there, even though it's very early stages for us, I think has been incredibly rewarding, and being able to have events where we're able to bring people into that conversation is also really rewarding. Because we do exist at a time of greater political polarization among elites, at least, than any time in our history since the Civil War. And in fact, today there's as much disapproval today of cross-partisan marriages as there was condemnation of interracial marriages 50 years ago. And so we have a very serious difficulty talking to each other, hearing each other, and that's one of the reasons I think it's so important that we're doing the work that we're doing. So that's the kind of value that I get from this.
Hi, I'm Debbie O'Malley. I'm an assistant professor in the Institute, and also got here in August, and so I'm thrilled to be here. Right now I'm teaching a course called Model U.S. Senate, where the students actually recreate historic Senate debates. They're assigned a particular senator, and they kind of learn all the material, and then they recreate the debate. And so we're doing the Treaty of Versailles debate next week, and that'll be the first of 3.
As I said, we'd like to make this a kind of recurring event, so these fireside chats. They take their name from the radio addresses that Franklin D. Roosevelt gave that really brought the arguments, the rhetoric, the ideas of the presidency into people's homes. And then President Reagan also hosted a fireside chat radio program. And So the idea here is that we're trying to cultivate a community, a close-knit community that intersects through our public events, through our courses, our programs, but that gets an opportunity to engage ideas with speakers, with first-hand practitioners in a more intimate setting like this. With that, I'd like to turn to the discussion with Reagan. Look, Reagan said that his self-education and the American political tradition came primarily through writing his own speeches in the 1950s when he was on the lecture circuit for General Electric manufacturing. He credited this period as the time when he abandoned his New Deal democratic opinions. And he said the following in 1976. He said, "Eventually what happened to me was, because I did my own speeches and did the research for them, I just woke up to the realization one day that I had been going out and helping to elect the people who had been causing the things I'd been criticizing. So it wasn't any case of some mentor coming in and talking me out of it. I did it in my own speeches." Now you were a speechwriter for President Reagan, and I neglected to introduce you fully. You were a speechwriter for Reagan and also for Vice President George H.W. Bush. Before that, right? You're on the board of the Eisenhower Foundation, the Pacific Research Foundation. But based on your experience as a speechwriter for Reagan, and in light of what I just said about his thoughts on being his own speechwriter early on, could you tell us about the working relationship between the speechwriter and this man who educated himself through speechwriting?
Reagan came to office very well defined. He had been, as you said, writing his own speeches for a long time. After he was became governor of California, for the first time, he had speech writers, a few, not like under the presidency, it's just a different office. But he had, all through that period, as a result of essentially extensive writing on politics, on economics, on foreign affairs, his radio broadcasts, which were basically columns. He also had columns in newspapers. These were all pointing towards what we now call American conservatism. He had become friends with William F. Buckley. Milton Friedman was a personal friend of his. He had read the works of Hayek and von Mises in economics. He had read the other side in economics as well. He had read a great deal of history. He knew the Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers. He was a voracious reader and a very fine writer. Actually, there's a story of his, at a point in his presidency, one of the prominent people on the National Security Council staff, which is the White House's own sort of internal State Department. Its job is to help the president formulate his policies, but also to mediate. This is a great deal, big part of the White House, at least in our term, mediate between the various agencies and departments that are involved in making foreign affairs and national security affairs. So state, defense, commerce, treasury, all of these are involved, as well as others. There's a story talking about mediation of state and defense where it odds on something, and so the Secretary of State, Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, and the Secretary of State get together for a breakfast at the White House, and they're going to smooth things out. They weren't talking to one another at the end of the breakfast. So the presidency, this is not unusual in the presidency, by the way. When Franklin Roosevelt was in office, you may recall, if you know your history of that period, that he took a destroyer out to the Pacific to inspect the troops in the island hopping campaign. That actually wasn't the prime reason for that trip. The prime reason was that Nimitz, who headed the Navy in the Pacific, and MacArthur, who headed the Army in the Pacific, were not getting along, and they were fighting over what the last half of the strategy would be. He went over and had them both in his come to his battleship, the two of them, and for a day they battled in front of him, and he was kind of getting them to see each other's position. The night comes, they go back to their wherever they were. They come in the morning, they've seen the light. I can imagine how the light was shown to them. And they tell the President Roosevelt, we've worked it out. And that made for that is a role of a president. And President Reagan did the same thing. Get people to cabinet. There's a story of the cabinet now meeting at which Mrs. Thatcher called in. You may know this story. It's a little bit, has been told before. In fact, every story I'm going to tell you has been told before, most of them. But Mrs. Thatcher calls, and I think it was during the Falklands issue, where we were actually not supporting the British government. And she gets on, and he's in the middle of a cabinet meeting. He takes it on the speakerphone and snaps off the voice on their side, the audio, so she can't hear them, but everybody in the cabinet can hear her, and she lights into Reagan, lights into him. And this goes on, and about halfway, 2/3 of the way through, he throws his head back, laughs, and says, "Isn't she magnificent?" Now, what do you think that was about? Mostly it's just his affection for her, as it's usually told. Something else as well. The cabinet, every member of the cabinet knows that we have a position. The British don't like it. They know that he's sticking to the position, but he's also saying, without saying it, and I've encountered this with myself sometimes, without saying it, he's saying, this makes no difference in our relationship. And that gets transmitted to every part of what the US government does at that point. Every member of the cabinet has heard it, has seen it, knows that he has the highest respect for her. They've got this difference. It doesn't matter. So the role of a president isn't just to edit speeches. We didn't have to. We would occasionally get edits from him. For example, one of my first speeches, not that I'm going to say that he may have had some reservations about it, but actually I get back the draft, and it's got basically every sentence has a word or two taken out of it. And he's written at the top, this is a fine speech, I've just sweated a little of the fat out of it. He was doing the same thing with me, not that I'm at the same level as Thatcher, but he was doing the same thing with me as he was doing with his cabinet with Thatcher. He's saying, don't worry about this, I'm just showing you how it's done, and I'm saying, I have a very lean style. And he's just guided me, and I never got another comment like that again. In fact, on the night at the end of the '88 campaign, he called me from the plane to say thank you. So his style was building, even as he might criticize as a speechwriter, he came to it in having speechwriters, he came to it having clearly defined what he was for, what he stood for, what his objectives were. Cabinet members a number of cabinet members were quoted as saying that they never really felt they had to consult the White House because the direction he was taking things was so clear, they knew what their job was. It's the same for the speechwriters. We knew what our job was. And one last story, he At one point, one of the national security advisor people came to him. I think it may have been Jack Matlock, who was a specialist on the Soviet Union and had a big role in our ultimate success regarding the Soviet Union, and said to him, "You know, Mr. President, I've noted that you are a very careful, very precise, actually the most precise and careful editor I have ever seen. And the press is portraying you as a dummy. I'd like to clue a few of them in." There's a lot more to what I'm about to say than you might imagine. That there's quite a lot to what I'm about to say. His response was, "Don't you dare." He did not want the press to know just how much was going on and how in charge he was. A lot of the things you heard in that period, suggesting he wasn't quite on top of it, he was cultivating. And he did that a lot. He, as Ed Meese once said to me, and some others, said he was highly intelligent and he didn't want you to know it. So you ask about what that is, that's my answer.
Reagan did have this reputation for being intellectually shallow. And I knew from a lot of my own reading, hearing other speeches of him, but also preparing for my course, that this is just not true at all. And while it is interesting that Reagan allowed it to be cultivated, where did this come from in the first place? How did he ever get that reputation?
Well, the first is he was conservative. And the norm at that time was in the media, in academia, no running down of academia here, but you guys are a sign of of possible change in academia. And the Institute is a brilliant concept and much needed in American education. Don't you think so? But this was before you guys came along. And it's very simple. The norm from basically the early 50s on was that conservatives were dumb and liberals were smart. You mentioned that I'm on the board of the Eisenhower Foundation, based in Abilene. Eisenhower was considered a dummy by the media. We know now that he couldn't speak, he couldn't write, you had to have people working for him. We know now, of course, that he was a precise writer, like Reagan. He was very careful about how he used his public appearances to shape his programs, both domestic and foreign, like Reagan. Turns out, I didn't know this until I got onto the Eisenhower staff and board rather, and I introduced them to the Reagan board, which I had relationships with. And the Reagan people were saying, which the Eisenhower people didn't know, Eisenhower tutored Reagan. We hear about the hidden hand presidency of Eisenhower. This is that he would be doing lots of things but wouldn't publicize them, which was very much Reagan's style too. Very careful about what was brought to attention and not preening. Well, it turns out that in the first 2 years of his governorship in California, Reagan, as I was told, and Eisenhower met frequently. It was clear at that point that Reagan might be president, and I'm pretty sure that Eisenhower was tutoring him. And Reagan's style in the presidency, it combined lots of styles. But the running of the government, the administrative part, the use of what was known and what wasn't, was very similar to Eisenhower's. In fact, it looked like it was copied, I think because it was. So you ask, well, how did it get started? It got started because that was the mindset of the intelligentsia, which seems a more ironic for that period label than every day. But it was all, Reagan used that rather than trying to correct that. And it was part of the strength of his presidency. It was kind of thinking that it's better that people underestimate you than overestimate you.
He was approached by one of his staff who asked if they could publish the reading list, the list of books that Reagan was reading through on a monthly basis. And he said, no, just the Louis L'Amour novels.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
So Reagan earned a nickname during his presidency, the Great Communicator. Mm-hmm. And in his 1989 farewell address, here's what he has to say about it. He says, "But I never thought it was my style or the words I used that made a difference. It was the content. I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things. And they didn't spring full bloom from my brow. They came from the heart of a great nation, from our experience, our wisdom, and our belief in the principles that have guided us for 2 centuries. They called it the Reagan Revolution. Well, I'll accept that. But for me, it always seemed more like the great rediscovery, a rediscovery of our values and our common sense." So my question is, was Reagan being modest here? What was the relationship between the ideas he communicated and the style or words that he used to communicate those ideas?
Well, he was right, and he was understating. It's different listening to a speech, just going out and listening to a speech, and listening to it if you've written it. And this is something I discovered very quickly, more with Reagan, not so much with Bush. There was a moment when we had a room in the complex. They had a room in the complex. I don't own it, by the way. I was an occasional visitor. We had a room called Room 450. It was, that big wedding cake of a gray wedding cake of a building next to the White House. That was at the time called the old Executive Office Building. It's now called the Eisenhower Office Building. And on the 4th floor, there was a moderate auditorium. It was probably a little wider than this. It was probably about the size of this room. And, seating going up so everybody can see, and places where the media could put up their cameras and all. It was a good room for bringing in groups and being able to generate news from it. And my first speech that was given in that room, I had a section that had a very particular meaning. And he comes to it, and he goes through it, and it comes out of his mouth, and it has a different meaning. Same words, different meaning. With inflection, with the way his presentation, the cocking of the head to one side. Well, that sort of thing. He had changed the meaning. And what I realized at that point, before I discovered other things that reinforced it, this is a man who has tremendous sensitivity to language. Gene Hackman recently died, as you know, tragic circumstances. But he, you may have seen in the stories that when he was interviewed for the program Actors Studio, he told about his father walking out and seeing the father pass in a car and waving just a little wave, and he knew immediately what had happened. And 65 years later, he broke into tears when he heard it. He said he learned at that point the power of a small gesture. Good thing for an actor to know. But Reagan knew it too. Not only a small gesture, but a small change of inflection, a small change in timing, a small change in how whether you smiled at something or whether you said, "Isn't she magnificent?" and whether you did something else. So there was a great deal of that in the Reagan, in my experience with Reagan, and I'm sure everybody else who worked with him.
Holger, let me be a little bit of a political philosopher here, but hearing Reagan speak, particularly some of a range of his different speeches, I wonder about him as a sort of political thinker. So, when I see people reason throughout sort of political philosophical history, some people are very involved in a very current conflict. They're thinking very pragmatically about how to resolve this or that dispute. But Reagan, at least in his language, his rhetoric, would oftentimes sort of zoom out to big, kind of broad principles, right? Saying, or general things about government being the problem, for instance, or talking about sort of eternal or universal ideals of freedom, people's universal desire to sort of breathe free. There are all kinds of different claims that he would make. And was that more the rhetorical flourishes, or was he sort of more of what you might think of as a political thinker, someone who was behind the scenes also reasoning in terms of his commitment to certain principles and certain ideals?
Well, he was a political thinker, and he was brought to politics by a combination of things, but he showed an interest in politics all the way through, an interest really in governance all the way through. He'd been a very successful leader of his union, but he was also, part of that success was taking on the communists who were trying to take over the movie industry at that time. That wasn't a small thing to him. He was against it, and he stood up against it. And he had to carry a gun for some periods because there were people who wanted to shoot him. And he believed what he stood for. He had the scars to show it. And he, when he did that famous speech for Barry Goldwater, the Time for Choosing speech, he didn't have to do that. Goldwater was going to be creamed. But he believed in what he was saying. And he stood up. And one of the things is, he stood up when other people wouldn't. And so, this isn't a man who, he was very good at negotiating. He was, in a sense, in his life, we think of him as a movie actor, he was a professional negotiator. He had a long and very successful time as representative of as the head of the Screen Actors Guild. One of the, I got involved in the Reagan campaign in New York City. Good place to get, it turned out. I was living there, and so, but it turns out that's a good place, New York City. A lot of people who are prominent in it. One of the people who was a volunteer in our office was a woman named Lillian Gish. I don't know if you know that name, but she was one of the top stars in Hollywood during the silent era and the early sound era. She didn't say this to me, but she did say something reported to me. He was the best president the Screen Actors Guild had ever had. She knew. She actually, trivia here, before the sound era, you've heard all about the place of women in Hollywood. It didn't exist, apparently, before the sound era. Before the sound era, women were very powerful in Hollywood, and I'm not quite sure why it changed with sound. It may have been the Depression and desire to give men jobs or something. I don't know why it was, but it did change. But in the sound era, in the pre-sound era, she was one of the top people in Hollywood, not just top actors, top people. And she said, Screen Actors Guild, he was the best they had ever had. So this is a man who believed in things, and the power, ultimately, the power of his position was that he believed in important things, universal things that had been forgotten or were being brushed under the rug. And that the momentum of the times was getting more liberal, and somebody had to step up. This is a period when William F. Buckley stood up. This is a period when a number of others started to stand up who later became prominent in the Reagan transformation. But it wasn't a time when these positions enjoyed wide support. He had read Hayek. Hayek was widely read, at least in his first book, The Road to Serfdom, first book that made an imprint in the United States. Von Mises, who was not widely read. Milton Friedman, who at the time wasn't widely read. He was also widely read in constitutional questions. He'd read the Federalists. He'd read the constitutional debates. He knew the constitutional the concepts of the American Constitution and the reasons for them, and understood its mechanism for preserving liberty. He believed in that, he understood that, and he could articulate that. He didn't need me. I wrote one of the major speeches he gave on the Constitution, but he didn't need me to do that. He could have done it himself. President of the United States, he might have something else to do that day than spend the night writing that. But this was a man for whom being a philosopher, I think he probably could have taught a number of courses in philosophy. But that's not where he wanted to go. He wanted to go where he was using the radio, and he was using the columns to argue a case, but he was for arguing a case. He wasn't just for examining a case. And he was doing it in the places where arguments were heard. And he was running for office. And that changed the world.
Yeah, I came across a line this morning actually from Reagan where he said, I think I've done pretty well for myself. I think this was either in his second term or after office. So I think I've done pretty well. And I often wonder how far I could have gone if I'd studied in school. So, actually, before we turn to the broader question and answer, I did have one other question to ask, because it's come up a few times today, and that is, you wrote for both a vice president and for a president, and they're two very different men, but we've also talked about they're two very different offices. And so recently, there was a speech in Munich that Vice President Vance gave that got a lot of attention. And so there's a lot of interest, I think, in the rhetoric proper to the vice president. So I was just wondering if you could say just a little bit about that, the difference between the two offices and the rhetoric and the speech writing for either.
Sure. Well, the first thing is, if you're president, you're making or writing for a president, everything you write is policy, okay? When you write for a vice president, everything you say is supporting the president's policy, unless you're in like a John Nance Gardner, who was FDR's first, who became disillusioned with FDR, or there aren't many who become hostile or at least dissenting from their president. So this was Vice President Bush we were reflecting the White House line. Clearance in our office, in that office, was within the office. Most of the vice president's remarks did not get circulated to the government as a whole, as the president's remarks do for comment. But the question the office was asking, one of the questions was, is this consistent with Reagan, with what the president wants? I am confident that, particularly given that President Trump is such a wilting flower, I am confident that Vice President Vance did not come up with that without clearing it with the president. There's no sign of that, and there's no sign that he would do that. He's a smart guy. He's a really smart guy. So with the president, you're always, you're potentially making policy every time he opens his mouth. World leaders are looking at you. You're thinking about that. I was always different with the vice president, where I was thinking of a small audience and the White House and all that. With the president, I was always thinking of that, all those layers of audience. There's the audience immediately in front of you. There is the forest of cameras and reporters in back of the room. The ones that Trump points out and says they're horrible people. There is behind them, there are the editors and producers who will decide what they write and what they film, and the stand-ups they use are going to be used in broadcast or film. Behind them is the country as a whole and all the various constituencies. And behind them, and also the entire apparatus, the Congress, the governors, state legislators, all of whom might be business people. Behind them are world leaders. And you've got to think of all of these at the same time, and how things are playing with each one when you're writing for the president, not when you're writing for the vice president. I mentioned to you today that there was one time, I think it was the run-up for the Vienna summit, the first summit with Gorbachev, and the Soviets were floating a line which our media, in its patriotism, had picked up and was trying to trip us up on it. Something, I don't even remember what the issue was now, but it was serious at the time. And we had a speech coming up that was going to be a little bigger than most for the vice president. I think it may have been at Westminster College in Westminster, Kansas, Missouri, where Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech was given. But in any event, it was to be given, and it was going to get more than usual interest. And I went to him and I said, I think if we do X, Y, and Z, and I'm sorry, I forget what X, Y, and Z was, okay? But if we do X, Y, and Z, I think we can trip up the Soviets and put this away. And he thought about it and he said, okay, go ahead and do it. I'm sure he cleared that with the president before we went out and did it. Just didn't share with me that he was clearing it with the president, but I'm sure he did. He gave it, we tripped up the Soviets and we stopped the US media, and the president went into the, whatever that was no longer a factor in trying to compromise our position. And that's a vice president making policy, but he's making policy by consulting with the president and doing it in consultation with the president, also probably with several of his advisors. So these are very different roles, and you just have to be sensitive to your role, your principal, his interest, and your audience, what they're looking for.
Okay, so with that, maybe if anybody in the audience who has a question for Clark or for general discussion.
Some of my friends are dead. They died when we were 40.
because they were abusers and they just kept abusing. And again, I just want you to, if you would, can you comment more about that in particular? Because that, as a kid, I can remember thinking, here's a guy, he's the president, and he's saying something so simple, and it's something that I've already in my mind said, yeah, that's, because I was around it a lot, it was around me, and my friends respected me, but I literally was like, no thanks, no thanks. My friends and brothers were like, hey, can't you just leave him alone? He's not gonna participate tonight with that. And so I just would like to hear more about that from you.
The time that the Just Say No campaign occurred, a major college basketball player who was clearly set to go to the NBA told people he was partying with that he was strong as a horse and he could do anything with cocaine, and he was dead that night. Mr. Reagan, Mrs. Reagan, he didn't really talk a lot about these things, but they were very, very sensitive to them. And I know of people who came into his office and just people who told him about their experiences, their friends' experiences, broke into tears, and he gave, he was very compassionate, didn't publicize it. Candidly, it's one of my worries for my grandsons, because this stuff is still, it's different now, but it's the same general thing. It was, it wasn't that he was a teetotaler, but he didn't drink very much. I'm not sure he would ever have, after that incident, there was a childhood book about, one of these sort of like Tom Swift or Hardy Boys. But this was about it was more like a Horatio Alger story about a boy whose father was like Reagan's father, and who resolved he was going to do something else in life. And who wore a brown suit as he became a man, and went out and did things in the world. And my understanding is Reagan read that as a boy and told his mother that's what he wanted to be like. And if you went to his ranch house up near Santa Barbara, which was up in a very steep climb up a pretty high mountain, clearly designed to make it difficult for people to come if they were of no good and all. But it was a beautiful ranch on the top, very simple. I think he built it himself. He had a bookshelf, and there were a few books, this is after his death, there were a few books on there. And this book I just mentioned was one of them. Again, not a lot of showmanship in it all, but a determination which, at a time when people on the left were kind of, well, laissez-faire, if you will, about these things. He was not. To my knowledge, none of his kids ever had a problem with anything like that. And glad to hear your story.
I was sharing with some of the people here that I rode my motorcycle to Washington, D.C. for Reagan's funeral. That was my first election I voted in him, and I thought I owed it to him.
Yeah.
We'd come out of the 70s, the horrible Carter years, and he brought pride back to Americans. I know he would never do this, but if he were sitting in the room with Donald Trump, what advice would he give President Trump?
Oh, of course I'm going to answer that. Donald Trump today is different than Donald Trump was 8 years ago. And I think Donald Trump has learned some of those lessons already. He was too strident and too in your face in the first term. Some of that was strategic and some of it was ill-advised, okay? We were talking early, Kevin and I, about one of the strategic parts. So I'll tell you that story so I can get around answering your question. You remember how I used to tweet in the morning? And people would say, why are you doing that? That's just, well, there was strategy behind that. And let me tell you what the strategy was. In the first, this is my reading of the strategy, not, Donald Trump did not call me up and say, Clark, I want to read this tweet to you. Oh no, Mr. President, are you sure? No, he didn't do that with me. But it was a given that the media was reflexively and hostilely and viciously against him. The root of a day in the news cycle at that time was that New York Times first edition came out about 11 p.m. I think that was the time, 11 p.m. or midnight. I think it was a little before midnight. Then they'd tear it apart and redo it at least 2 times in the course of the night. Issues would go out, but then they'd decide something would happen and they'd update it. But if they were doing a hit on the president, that would be that would be the lead. And in the morning, the morning shows, you may recall, always had the New York Times, Washington Post, and a few others on their desk as they went on camera at about, 6 a.m., is it? And they were going off of the morning papers. So if there was something that the press wanted to do to really stick it to President Trump, which was, I'd say, as a restrained estimate, a low estimate daily. They'd have something in that edition at 6 o'clock, and it'd be on the front page. And our first chance, unless the president said something, ad-libbed something in a speech that morning to some group, and there were a lot of mornings when we had one that, or said something on the way to the helicopter, we wouldn't really get around, the White House wouldn't get around to answering it until noon. And at that point, it was the White House sort of trailing behind. So the story would lead in the evening news with a response from the White House. A day or 2 days later would be time to, we would have written a speech, and we would do it in a way that was meant to both change the, rebut the story, correct the record, and also point in a direction that we wanted the story to go. So that's a day later, 2 days later. What happened in the first year of Trump's presidency? Same time, it's changed since then. The New York Times, Washington Post are getting the edition out, first edition out, and then the second, third, and then the one, and then the one just before. But just before the morning shows go on. But by that point, it's in. And what happens 5 minutes before the show goes on? A presidential tweet. And the more incendiary the story is, the more outrageous the tweet was. And all of a sudden, the story of the day that the New York Times was planning is gone. And it wasn't necessarily, the president wasn't necessarily responding to the story. It can respond to a story or do something to direct them to another story. But it was gone. And Trump was dominating that period. Now, the first year of the Trump presidency, a lot of the agenda was deregulation. And there was a general attempt by the media, as there is now, to discredit it. Regulation good, free enterprise bad. Good summary of how the major media thinks of economics and regulation. So I talked about this at a dinner during that period, that being the reason, because people were saying dinner unlike this. And somebody who was fairly senior at this Treasury staff piped in and said, well, we had a regulation, I don't recall what it was, I don't think he said what it was, but we had a big regulation and we were sure we were going to be crucified for it and we'd have to live through 6 weeks of hell. But he tweeted just before the morning shows that where this was breaking, and we never heard a word. So there was a lot of strategy in that tweeting, and it was how do you move the news cycle, not necessarily the issue, but the news cycle, to deal with this reflexive hostility of the media. And this is something to keep in mind about his look at media and about communications, that this is Trump now, the strategy of it. Look at his cabinet. He made a conclusion clearly during the period he was out of government, that he had very competent men and women in his cabinet. Competent for the immediate tasks, but not necessarily competent or at least optimal for communication, which had much more to do with whether he could get programs through. And so this cabinet is filled with people who understand how to use media, have been in media, are good at delivering messages in media, and who are, as such, can carry the president's message in a way that was most of the members of the cabinet in his first term could not do. That just wasn't part of their skill set. And so that's, yes, the tweeting and all was often outrageous, but that form of, and there were times when he might have learned from Mr. Reagan about things. I want to say one other thing before I move on about this. There is something people forget about Reagan and Trump. I was on BBC radio the other night, and there was a Democrat on, and we ended up in a big shouting match, and I'm sure it was entertaining to the audience, but it was kind of a mess. But he was saying, oh, Reagan would never put up with what Trump is doing. Reagan would not, this is a disgrace. Well, if we want to talk about disgraces, how about Biden? But that's a joke, okay? Unlike Reagan, the delivery doesn't tell the message, so I have to tell people that I have just told a joke. The fact is, the two had something in common that no two presidents, I think, possible with the exception of Eisenhower, in terms of what he did in the Second World War, but he was more of a mediator then. These, they were both professional negotiators. They were Reagan as a union man, Trump as in business, they were both men who had gone through many cycles of negotiation and understood the dynamics of negotiation and understood some of what we're seeing now. If you've got a difficult situation, you go in with a big demand that just has everybody apoplectic, and then you negotiate back from there. He's doing this to some extent with Zelensky. Actually, and with Putin. And you see him making the threats at both of them. And it's basically it's a little bit like a cowboy trying to herd a few cattle into a pen. Well, sometimes you have to cut left and cut right and to move them in. And there's a lot of that going on. Reagan was, I would say, perhaps the most sophisticated negotiator ever in the White House, and Trump, we'll see how this term goes, but he's in contention for being tied, or if he can get things done in Ukraine, he's got a big claim on being absolutely in the same league.
So first, thank you to the Institute for sponsoring this, and thank you for being here. It's a wonderful evening. And I was actually, to follow up on Ed, I was actually working in politics in 1980 in Washington, D.C., and it was a different time back then. And so that's my first question. My main question is, I don't think we can do it today, but can you explain to me kind of how Reagan was so successful in negotiating with Congress and even the Democrats, to get his policies through more than we see today? And then if you have a chance, I'm just curious how much Nancy influenced his decisions and his policies.
It was said that Nancy had very little influence on policy and a lot on personnel. But it should also be noted that there was a aphorism around the White House: personnel is policy. So, it sort of overlapped, but he listened to her on personnel often. But from what I could see, not that much on policy. What was your other question?
Well, how did he negotiate so well with Congress?
Well, the first thing is to keep in mind that his strength in negotiating with Congress was at its height when he was first in office. That's when the major packages got through. He was very good at, and they were afraid of him. The Democrats were afraid of him at that point. And they did lose a lot of people or at least key people who went across the aisle and in the Senate and House. But their fear was that they were going to lose big portions of their constituency to him. That didn't happen then. It seems to have happened this last election, and maybe even bigger next election, particularly if the Democrats keep behaving the way they did at the State of the Union address. I'm not kidding. I got a call from Fox News Digital, or an email the other day, and they said, the woman said, I'm doing a story for the weekend and about the event, and would you tell me what you thought? And she said she wanted it in writing. So I'd actually had an exchange with some of my buddies from the White House on this and told them what I thought. So I sent her what I had sent my buddies. And the whole thing ran this Sunday. But the thing that that strikes me is that I said in that was that in 1932-33, because of his what was seen as the fecklessness of the Hoover administration in the face of the Great Depression, and the humanity that FDR projected, which Hoover did not project, the Democratic Party claimed the mantle of the party of the common man, the party of compassion. The Republican Party was that party beforehand, and it claimed that under McKinley. When the economy turned around dramatically when McKinley won his first election and was doing things and held it until 32. And that dominated American politics for the next, up until it started to erode under Eisenhower, it started to erode a little more under Nixon, and Reagan, it eroded a lot. Then we have this last election and their behavior at the State of the Union, and it's gone. It is gone. We've already seen over the last several years that key constituencies they thought were theirs. They thought they could shout racism, and every African American and every Hispanic and every Asian would rally behind them, and they never understood what the values of a Hispanic family were. The tightness, that all the stuff that they were throwing out is anathema, and that if you're an African American, let's say either with you never knew your father if you were the man, or maybe you did, but let's say that somebody in your family didn't, and they are trying to, particularly women, trying to raise a child, and all of a sudden the sorts of things that the Democrats were advocating make it 100 times harder to raise your child. And I could go on. You know, you have a factory job, it's gone, and they're talking about, as somebody said, was quoted recently, Biden seemed to care more about having a man able to walk naked in his daughter's locker room than about the man's job. And that's how they came across. And at a certain point, we had already seen in the polling going over the last 4 years the erosion of the Democratic base. It was a continuation of what began under Eisenhower and built under Nixon and was very large under Reagan, the Catholic vote moving over to us. And now their core vote, and you wonder, where were these people? Where did they grow up? They're saying they're speaking for certain people, and they don't understand those people at all. Thank you. You're all allowed to clap. But where are they? And so we have, this is what's happened now. And it's, I have I'm inclined to say use for the Democrats, but that's too harsh. But I can't understand. It looks like a cult at this point, and I can't understand how a great American political party falls that far.
Have you ever faced a writer's block when writing one of your speeches? I just had to ask.
Of course not. When we had our first child, there was no second one, in just about the time I was becoming a presidential speechwriter. And so the last year, he's 2 years old. And his favorite thing, my wife would bring him over to the office so he could actually see his father, particularly in that last year in the campaign period. I had pulled more all-nighters than I did in college, total in college. And he had discovered that he could take the keys off of my word processor. And he could strip the word processor in under 30 seconds. Oh, yes. And I remember once they showed up by surprise, and I had a very large office. I'll never have an office like that again. But I had a very large office, and I was at one end, and the keyboard was sort of 2/3 to the other end. And in they come, and it is a race between dad and boy to get the boy. I was almost like a linebacker ready to jump over the desk to tackle him before he stripped. Well, yeah, he's alive today. And so he got to it faster than I did. But I did, I will tell you one thing about this. It's sort of the opposite end. For me, giving a speech, writing a speech, was a bit like being on a drug. No offense. I went into the world of the speech. Who were the people? What's going on in the audience? What's going on in the media? And it was a kind of euphoria that was all around it. And what's this we're doing, and how do I move it, and what are the inspirations, and what are the details and all that, and I'd go through and I'd go into it, and I'd read, and I'd start to write, and I'd move, and I'd turn it in. We'd go through clearance, which was a process sometimes easy, sometimes very difficult, where I'm mediating, negotiating among people, and I'm in this euphoria all the time. And then it's over, he gives it, and I'll listen to it. And then I have a crash. And I had to get to the next speech. And I'll never go through that again, and I miss it every day.